Hello and welcome to our third computer side chat, where today we're going to be looking to mesh together many of the concepts that we've talked about to this point. So we've covered a lot of ground in this unit, and we've covered things like what is power and what are the different ways that power can be applied. What is the social contract? In other words, it is this relationship between people and government, specifically a two-way relationship. And lastly, what is the purpose of government? In other words, what does government do? Now we're going to look to bring that all together by answering this question. If we understand what power is, and we accept that we're willing to give up power to a government so that it may serve its purpose, what does that power look like? In other words, how do we divide that power up within this governing system and also within an economic system within our country? So let's go ahead and dive into that. So again, we're going to be looking at governments and economies in this set of notes. And our central question is going to be, in what ways can a country organize the control of power and resources within their borders? And let's start by looking at the different forms of government and how those forms of government can be different depending on where you look. Let's start with autocracies. And an autocracy is when complete power sits with one individual. And there are three different types of autocracies that we're going to focus on. The first is a monarchy. And a monarchy is when complete power sits with one individual who gains that power due to their bloodline. In other words, you have a king. When that king dies, one of their children takes over, usually the firstborn son. A theocracy is where complete power sits with the religious leader of the country. In other words, the religion and the government are intertwined. The leader of the religion is also the leader of the country. And then lastly, you have a dictatorship. And a dictatorship is where complete power sits with the individual that controls the military and or police. In other words, rather than getting their ability to maintain power or say their sovereignty through religion or bloodline, theirs simply comes through force or through coercion. They're able to command their power and hold power due to their ability to make the people submit through force. Next form of government, let's look at democracies. And a democracy is where power sits with the people. The first type of democracy that we'll look at is direct democracy. And this is where citizens vote directly on laws and government decisions. In other words, there's no elected officials. The citizens vote directly on the decisions that their community will make. So this was seen in, say, ancient Athens, where the citizens voted directly on the decisions that they would make, rather than having, say, one general authority or authoritative body who would make those decisions. Next is a presidential democracy. This is also known as a republic, and this is what we have. And a presidential democracy is where citizens elect both lawmakers as well as the head of the executive branch to represent them. They make laws and government decisions. So in our system, we elect members of Congress, which is the lawmaking body, and we elect the president, which is the head of the executive branch. The legislative body is in charge of making laws. The president, the head of the executive branch, helps make sure that those laws are enforced. Lastly is a parliamentary democracy, and we see these for the most part in Europe, in European democracies. And a parliamentary democracy is where citizens elect lawmakers. The lawmakers then elect the head of the executive branch. They make the laws and the decisions. So in other words, in let's say somewhere like England. In England, the citizens there will vote for their legislature or their legislative representatives into a body known as Parliament. Parliament will then decide who their prime minister will be. And the prime minister is essentially the English version of a president. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, but for our purposes, we'll just go with that. So The people choose their legislators. The legislators choose the head of the executive branch. Lastly, we're going to look at hybrid forms of government. In other words, these are some kind of mix of both democracy and autocracy. First is an oligarchy, and again, this is a term you're probably familiar with. An oligarchy is where power resides with a select group of individuals. Now, generally, I think when you guys learned about oligarchies in middle school, they said that, oh, an oligarchy is when 3 people hold power. And certainly that could be an example of an oligarchy. But an oligarchy could also be something like, say, Russia, where, yes, Russia is a dictatorship, but the very wealthy individuals within Russia also command a whole lot of power and influence over the government. And so we would almost think of Russia as a type of oligarchy because these individuals have so much influence and power over the government, and they are so mixed into government decisions. So an oligarchy could be 3 people. It could also be, a couple hundred people within a country's large population. Next is a constitutional monarchy. And a constitutional monarchy is where a monarch exists, but their power is limited by a constitution and an elected body of representatives. So I talked earlier about Europe having a lot of parliamentary democracies, England being an example of that. Yet their parliamentary democracy is mixed up with a constitutional monarchy. In other words, England still has a queen. That queen doesn't really have a whole lot of power. The royal family is really more of a symbol now. They don't do a whole lot. In other words, the vast majority of power sits with England's parliament and their prime minister. Now, in earlier English history, when the king or queen still had power, they were a constitutional monarchy where the power of that king and queen was limited and other powers resided with the elected body of parliament. Lastly is an illiberal democracy or a single-party state. This is where people vote on their representatives, but there is really only one choice for them to vote for. So a lot of times you'll see this in countries that claim to be democratic republics, where they will hold quote-unquote presidential elections, and the sitting president will always win with like 97% of the vote. China is an example of this. China is essentially a one-party state where there is really only one political party. There's the Chinese Communist Party, and they basically hold all power within the Chinese government. Next, let's go to systems of government. This is how central government or federal government is divided up along with regional or state governments, as well as the power of the people. And there are 3 main systems that we're going to look at. The first is a unitary system. And a unitary system means that power is centralized in the national government. So regional state government only have powers that are given to them by the national government. So in other words, think of it this way. There's a United States government, and then there is government for each individual state, such as the state of Ohio. If we were under a unitary system, that means that the United States government would decide what decisions or powers that the state government of, say, Ohio would have. Next is a federal system, and this is the type of system that we have. In a federal system, power is divided between the national and state government. In other words, there are powers by the Constitution that are given to the federal government, and there are powers that are given to the state government. And the federal government does not get to decide what powers the states do and do not have. That is determined by the Constitution itself. Again, this is the type of system that we use. It's also referred to as federalism, and we'll get into that more down the road. Lastly is a confederal system. Power resides with the state governments. The national government only has powers that are given to it by the states. In other words, this is the flipped version of a unitary government. The states hold the majority of the power, and then the states get to decide what the federal government gets to do. So imagine if the state government of Ohio and Michigan and Illinois and all of the 50 states got to determine what the United States government residing in Washington, D.C. could do and could not do. So that's an example of a confederal system. So in other words, this is just three different ways that we divide power within government itself, whether we have a democracy, autocracy, or whatever it may be. Lastly, let's talk about economic systems. And there are three main economic systems that we are going to worry about. So when we talk about the economy, we are talking about the management of things like money and businesses and the selling and buying of goods and services. The first type of economy is a traditional economy. And this is where resources are controlled by individuals. It relies on the custom and history of a society to determine the worth of goods and services. So when we say goods and services, we're referring to the physical things that you can buy or the skills that people have that you can buy. In other words, an iPhone is a good. Let's say you drop your iPhone and break the screen. If you pay someone to repair that screen, you are paying for a service. In a traditional economy, essentially it is decided by individuals. What they do, how much they will charge, or how much they're willing to buy certain things for, whether that's money, whether that's trading, whether that's bartering. Basically, in a traditional economy, the price of things can be wildly different from one city to the next. Next is a market economy. In a market economy, resources are controlled by private entities, such as businesses. It relies on producers, the ones that make things, and consumers, the ones that buy things, to determine the worth of goods and services. In other words, this is the type of system that we think of when we think of capitalism. In other words, the free market determines the worth of things, how much producers are willing to sell something for, how much consumers are willing to buy it for. Somewhere in the middle, we find this equal ground of what people are willing to pay and what companies are willing to sell it for. And then lastly, there is a command economy. A command economy means that resources are controlled by the government, and government determines the worth of goods and services. So government controls everything about the economy. There's no private ownership of businesses or resources. It is all controlled by the government, and we tend to associate this with socialism or communism. All right, so that is a very quick rundown of different types of governments and economies, and I know I moved fast there. And so make sure that if you have any questions that you are writing that down in the questions section. I want to give us a lot of time to parse through this and talk about it tomorrow. So please, please, please come with questions. Go ahead and complete your summary section now. And then tomorrow we'll take the quiz and answer those questions for you. Have a good night.